camera loves rebels. And in 1959, the biggest rebel in Hollywood wasn't even supposed to be there. His name was Steve McQueen, and he was about to commit the most audacious crime in entertainment history. He was going to steal the crown from Frank Sinatra. Not with a gun, not with a scandal, not with politics, with a canteen. A simple metal canteen that he shook during the most important scene of Frank Sinatra's latest movie. And that tiny sound, barely audible above the dialogue, would echo through Hollywood like a gunshot. It would mark the exact moment the old world died and the new world was born. This is the story of the day. A nobody became somebody by refusing to be nobody. The day the king of cool wasn't Dean Martin or Frank Sinatra. The day it became Steve McQueen. But to understand how Steve McQueen stole everything, you need to understand what Frank Sinatra owned. And in 1959, Frank Sinatra owned everything. Francis Albert Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just an actor. He was the chairman of the board, the undisputed emperor of American entertainment. When Frank spoke, the industry listened. When Frank wanted something, the industry delivered. When Frank didn't want something, it disappeared. He had the power to make careers with a handshake and destroy them with a phone call. His inner circle, the Rat Pack, was the most exclusive club in the world. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, they were Hollywood royalty, and Frank was their king. The Rat Pack didn't just perform together, they lived by a code. Loyalty above all, respect the hierarchy, never upstage the chairman, and, most importantly, know your place. Everyone in Hollywood knew these rules. Everyone followed them, because crossing Frank Sinatra wasn't just career suicide. It was social suicide, financial suicide, complete exile from the only world that mattered. Frank's latest project was Never So Few, a World War II drama set in Burma. Frank would star as Captain Tom Reynolds, the tough, charismatic leader fighting behind enemy lines. It was the kind of role Frank was born to play, strong, confident, in complete control. The movie had a decent budget, a solid script, and Frank's golden touch. It was guaranteed to be a hit. For the supporting roles, Frank did what he always did. He hand-picked actors who understood the system, men who would be grateful for the opportunity and respectful of his position. Most of them were established names, safe choices, professionals who knew how to stay in their lane. But Frank needed one more actor for a small supporting role. A young soldier, just a few scenes, nothing too important. His casting director suggested a relatively unknown television actor who'd been making waves in a Western series called Wanted Dead or Alive. The kid was cheap, available, and reportedly professional. His name was Steve McQueen. Frank probably didn't even look at the headshot carefully. Why would he? It was a minor role. The kid would do his scenes, say thank you, and disappear back to television where he belonged. Frank had bigger things to worry about. What Frank didn't know was that Steve McQueen had never said thank you to anyone in his life, and he wasn't about to start with Frank Sinatra. Steve McQueen arrived on the set of Never So Few like a force of nature. He didn't walk, he stalked. He didn't speak, he drawled. He didn't wear his costume, he inhabited it. From the moment he stepped onto that sound stage, something in the air changed. The crew noticed it. The other actors noticed it. Even Frank noticed it, though he didn't understand what he was seeing. McQueen was different. He wasn't trying to fit in, trying to impress anyone, trying to play the game. He was just being Steve McQueen. And Steve McQueen was dangerous. The first sign of trouble came during the driving scenes. The movie required several sequences with military jeeps racing through jungle terrain. Frank expected the actors to let the stunt drivers handle the dangerous stuff. That's how it always worked. Stars didn't risk their million-dollar faces on unnecessary stunts. Steve McQueen took one look at those jeeps, and his eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "I'll drive," he said. The stunt coordinator tried to explain the protocols, union rules, insurance policies, safety concerns. McQueen wasn't listening. He was already behind the wheel, gunning the engine, testing the clutch. And then he was gone, tearing across the lot like a man possessed. The crew watched in horror as McQueen pushed those Jeeps to their absolute limits. He took corners on two wheels, jumped small hills, skidded through turns that should have rolled the vehicle. He drove like someone who'd been doing it his whole life, which he had. McQueen had been racing motorcycles and cars since he was a teenager. These Hollywood vehicles were toys to him, but it wasn't just the skill that impressed people. It was the fearlessness. McQueen drove those Jeeps like he had nothing to lose, because he didn't. He was a nobody from nowhere with no reputation to protect. If he crashed, if he died, if he destroyed expensive equipment, so what? He'd been broke before. He could be broke again. Frank watched this display with growing concern. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Actors were supposed to be careful, professional, controllable. This kid was none of those things. During the first week of shooting, Frank tried to establish the usual set hierarchy. He'd gather the cast and crew for informal meetings, laying out expectations, making it clear who was in charge. Everyone nodded respectfully, asked intelligent questions, showed appropriate deference. Everyone except Steve McQueen. McQueen would sit in the back, slouched in his chair, that famous blue-eyed stare fixed on something in the distance. He wasn't disrespectful. Exactly. He wasn't argumentative or difficult. He was just absent, like the whole production was happening around him, but not to him. When Frank spoke directly to him, McQueen would nod and say, "Yeah, sure, Frank." Not Mr. Sinatra or Sir, like everyone else. Just Frank. Like they were equals. The real trouble started during the dramatic scenes. Frank took his acting seriously. He prepared extensively, worked with the director on motivation and subtext, demanded multiple takes to get everything perfect. He expected the other actors to match his level of professionalism and intensity. McQueen had a different approach. He'd show up, barely glance at the script, and then improvise his way through the scene. He'd change lines, add gestures, interact with props that weren't in the direction, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. His natural charisma and instincts made even his mistakes feel authentic. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was where he did it. During one crucial scene, Frank was delivering a lengthy monologue about the nature of war, the burden of command, the weight of responsibility. It was the kind of speech Frank excelled at, full of gravitas and emotion. The camera was focused on him. The lighting was perfect, and Frank was giving the performance of his career. And in the background, barely visible, Steve McQueen was playing with a canteen. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. McQueen was just fidgeting with the prop, unscrewing the cap, shaking it gently, adjusting the strap. Tiny movements, barely noticeable, except they were noticeable, because Steve McQueen had something that couldn't be taught or learned or bought. He had magnetism. Every person watching that scene found their eyes drifting from Frank's powerful monologue to the kid in the background. They couldn't help it. There was something about the way McQueen moved, the way he carried himself, the way he seemed completely unaware of the camera while simultaneously commanding its attention. Frank noticed it too. He could feel the energy in the room shifting, could sense that he was losing focus, losing control, but he couldn't stop mid-scene to call it out. So he pushed through, delivering his lines with even more intensity, trying to reclaim the spotlight through sheer force of will. It didn't work. The more Frank projected, the cooler McQueen became. The more Frank demanded attention, the more effortlessly McQueen drew it away. When the scene ended, Frank called for a break. He needed to think about what had just happened. He'd been upstaged before, But never like this. Never by accident. Never by someone who didn't seem to realize he was doing it. Frank pulled the director aside. "What's the kid's deal?" The director, John Sturgis, shrugged. "He's got something. I can't put my finger on it, but the camera loves him." "The camera loves me," Frank said pointedly. "Yeah, of course. But with him, it's different. It's like he's not even trying." And that was the problem. Steve McQueen wasn't trying. He was just being himself. And himself was more interesting than Frank Sinatra's carefully constructed persona. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every scene McQueen was in, he dominated without effort. He'd light a cigarette during someone else's close-up. He'd adjust his helmet during a dramatic moment. He'd check his watch while another actor delivered crucial exposition, and every tiny movement drew attention like a magnet. Frank tried different approaches. He tried directing McQueen more specifically, giving him precise instructions about where to stand and what to do. McQueen would nod agreeably and then do whatever he wanted anyway. He tried talking to McQueen privately, explaining the collaborative nature of filmmaking, the importance of supporting other actors' moments. McQueen would listen with that distant expression and say, "Yeah, I get it, Frank." He even tried intimidation, reminding McQueen who he was dealing with, what he could do to his career, and that's when McQueen smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a nervous smile. It was the smile of a man who'd grown up on the streets, who'd been in reform school, who'd survived the Merchant Marine and a dozen jobs that would have broken other men. It was the smile of someone who'd been threatened by scarier people than Frank Sinatra and lived to tell about it. "I appreciate the advice, Frank," McQueen said, his voice calm and steady. "But I'm just here to do my job." Frank realized in that moment that he was dealing with something he'd never encountered before. Not a young actor grateful for the opportunity, not a professional colleague respecting the hierarchy, not even a rebel trying to make a statement. He was dealing with someone who simply didn't care about any of it. The fame, the power, the rules, the consequences. McQueen was completely immune to the system that Frank had spent decades building, and that immunity made him dangerous. The breaking point came during the dailies. Every evening, Frank would watch the footage from that day's shooting. It was his way of maintaining quality control, making sure everything met his standards. Usually, he'd watch with satisfaction as his scenes played out exactly as he'd envisioned them. But these dailies were different. Every scene featuring Steve McQueen told a different story than the one Frank had been directing. On screen, McQueen wasn't a supporting actor playing a minor role. He was a star in waiting, stealing focus and commanding attention with every gesture. The worst part was that it wasn't malicious. McQueen wasn't trying to upstage anyone. He was just being himself. And himself was electric. Frank sat in that screening room, watching his own movie being quietly taken over by a kid he'd barely heard of a month ago. And for the first time in his career, he felt something he'd never experienced before: obsolescence. The old Hollywood system was built on respect, hierarchy, and playing by the rules. Frank had mastered that system, become its ultimate expression. But Steve McQueen represented something new, a different kind of cool, a different kind of star, someone who didn't need permission to be charismatic. When Never So Few was released later that year, the reviews confirmed what Frank already knew. Critics barely mentioned his performance. Instead, they wrote about the exciting new face of Steve McQueen and a star in the making. The movie that was supposed to be another Frank Sinatra vehicle had become Steve McQueen's calling card. Within a few years, McQueen would be the biggest star in Hollywood. He'd command enormous salaries, choose his own projects, and define a new kind of masculine cool that would influence generations of actors. He'd become exactly what Frank had been, but for a different era. And he'd done it all by refusing to bow down to the king. Frank Sinatra remained a legend, a giant of entertainment history, but his reign as the undisputed ruler of Hollywood was over. The crown had been passed, not through ceremony or succession, but through the simple act of one man refusing to acknowledge another man's supremacy. Steve McQueen never stole anything. He just walked into a room and made it his own. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The lesson of Steve McQueen isn't about rebellion or disrespect. It's about authenticity. In a world of carefully managed images and calculated performances, genuine charisma will always stand out. You can't manufacture it, you can't fake it, and you can't stop it. Frank Sinatra spent decades building an empire based on control and hierarchy. Steve McQueen destroyed it in 3 weeks by simply being himself. Have you ever witnessed someone quietly take over a room without saying a word? What did that look like?